Have a project on U.S.-Chinese relations over the longer term, and that project is a little bit different from the ones that typically, I think, take place in this particular city, which tend to be more focused on specific issues, short-term kinds of questions. What should our position be in the South China Sea? Are the exchange rates in balance? You know, a whole series of things of that sort. So we've decided in this particular meeting to step back a little bit and to ask ourselves, given historical patterns, is it likely that the rise of China as compared to the United States will have fundamentally peaceful outcomes, or will it, as is historically true, when you find a rising power coming up to approach a hegemonic leader, in most of the cases where those have taken place, there has been major war. Now, it may well be that we're in a different situation now for economic reasons. It may be that we're in a different situation for financial reasons. It may well be we're in a different situation for security or defense reasons, whatever that may be. But nonetheless, I think it's important to think in terms of what the long term holds. Most economists, not all, looking simply at GDP, see there being a period in the 21st century in which Chinese overall GDP, not per capita GDP, will be larger than that of the United States. So this is not an idle issue. It's an issue that we are going to confront in a fairly short-term period of time. Now, how do we arrange not to have another, what shall we say, war between Britain and Holland, which was a war of this kind? How do we avoid having another war between Britain and Germany, which also involved hegemonic passing? How do we arrange our futures in the sense in which it is possible to transcend the typical historical lesson, which nonetheless is fairly pessimistic? So I'd like to introduce our group here, and we've got the great advantage of having with us, in addition, Bob Hormats, who's Undersecretary of State. And but we're going to start. I think maybe we'll start with you. Is that all right? Because you have to run. Okay. So we'll start with Bob Hormats, and thank you a lot for coming, Bob.
Well, thanks very much. This has been, we had an interesting discussion of some of these issues at lunch. I'd just like to touch briefly on 3 points that perhaps will sort of set the stage for some of the discussions that will take place over the next day or day and a half. One of them is that one of the key determinants of how the United States and China will be able to work together over the next decade or two is going to be how well the United States addresses its own domestic challenges. Whether the United States can deal with the challenge from China will in part clearly depend on the competitive strengths of China and the policies of China. But equally importantly, from an American point of view, in an area where we have more control than we do over Chinese policies or the economic rise of China, is how we address our own domestic economic challenges. The more effectively we can address our fiscal challenge, the more effectively we can deal with our own educational system and the ability to educate larger and larger numbers of people, our ability to deal with the challenges of developing innovative new technologies to make ourselves increasingly a world-class competitor, our ability to deal with our own domestic unemployment problem, our structural unemployment problem, our ability to deal with our infrastructure problem, our ability to deal with our energy problem. Those are going to be key determinants of our ability also to address the China challenge. So there is always a tendency to look at the China challenge and say, all right, what's China doing? How do we deal with China? I would say the first prerequisite is to figure out how we deal with our own internal challenges and to deal with those as effectively as we can. Because if we cannot deal with these effectively, then our ability to address the challenge of China, the challenge of the changing global system, will be diminished. If we can deal with them successfully over the course of the next several years and beyond, then our ability to influence the course of events in the global economic system will be considerably greater. And what's more, we will be seen, as we have been in the past, as an example of a country that is resilient, whose system is successful in dealing with these kinds of internal challenges. And we will have both greater strength internally, more resources internally, and will command a greater degree of influence, or, as Joe and I would put it, soft power externally. If we can't, our soft power diminishes, and our resources that we have available to bring to bear on global economic challenges will also be diminished. Our ability to negotiate trade agreements will be diminished because people will be so concerned about our domestic policies that they will be reluctant to provide support for the government to take advantage of external opportunities. Our ability to engage on a wide range of political fronts will be diminished because people will be more inward-looking because of the persistence of these domestic problems. So that's one area. A second area that I think is very important, and this is more on the external side, is recognizing that in addressing the issues related to China and in the broader context of the Group of 20, we're dealing with countries that have a very different history from those of the traditional G7 countries. The traditional G7 countries, by and large, the United States certainly and the others as well, are countries that have relatively strong economy, or large economies, or at least did. In some cases, they're not as important in the global system as they have been in the past. But they're all countries that have very high GDPs per capita. When we look at China from the outside, we look at a country that has very robust competitive industries, that has an enormous amount of financial power. The financial power is growing, that is developing a lot of new technologies. We look at China as a very strong global competitor. Why do we look at it? Because it is. It's increasingly competitive. It displays a number of the attributes of a very competitive industrialized country, and its financial power, its commercial power, and its growing role in the global system. When the Chinese look at themselves, they look at themselves somewhat differently. They clearly see that they're a competitive country and important in the financial system, but they have a number of characteristics that apply to developing countries as well. They have a lot of people who live on very low incomes. They have a lot of people who do not have social safety nets. A lot of people don't get the kind of health care that we're used to in the industrialized world. So they're not like other G7 countries. They have a very different set of domestic targets and domestic priorities that are very different from those of the countries that were the steering group of the global system for much of the last half century. And I think this conditions the way they look at the world. This conditions the way they look at their own priorities. They do not see themselves as being as robust as we do because they have these internal challenges, and these are serious challenges. In a large country like China, these challenges are serious of people who are simply not getting the kind of social benefits and see parts of China benefiting enormously from growth and prosperity, while certain pockets of China do not. And keeping China together and keeping the system growing at a very rapid rate, sufficient to create a lot of new jobs, to create stability or sustained stability, is an enormous challenge. And China looks at their challenges somewhat differently internally from the way we look at them externally. And the last point relates to the nature of the dialogue we have with China. And that is clearly the objective of the United States, and I believe the objective of China also, is to deal with the challenges that we face between one another and in the global system in a constructive way. I do not think there is a view in either Beijing or Washington that these issues should be dealt with through confrontation. There should be, and there is, a strategic economic dialogue. There are a lot of other dialogues that are going on. The difference, however, is an important one, and that is, if you look at the United States, we have a tradition that has been developed really since World War II of global responsibility, or a sense of responsibility for the global system. This, in part, came from the fact that we had to create the new global system after World War II and maintain it because it was in our interest to do that. It was in our interest to have an inclusive trading system, to have the World Bank and the IMF to deal with global problems, to have an open, rules-based global system, which includes more and more countries in it. And I think if you look back, it was a great success. You know, the Cold War did not end with World War III. It ended with more and more countries joining the global system that the United States and a few others had created after World War II. So we have that sense of responsibility. Americans understand it to be in the U.S. interest by and large, and therefore we have domestic support for this global leadership role. Now, there are Americans who are saying, well, maybe you shouldn't be doing this or that, or some are sort of tired of spending lots of resources on some of these endeavors, but by and large, Americans understand we need to do it. It's in America's interests. It's part of the American tradition since World War II, and it's benefited us from a security point of view, a political point of view, and an economic point of view. China, I think it's important to realize, does not come from the same tradition. China has not had that history of having a sense of global responsibility or responsibility for the global system. It's been dealing with largely, for the second point, reason I described, that is, they've been dealing with a lot of domestic problems, and that's been their focus. Now they have a huge stake in the global system, as big a stake, one could argue, as any other country in the world, and some would argue an even greater stake. So the nature of the dialogue that we have with the Chinese should be to help them to understand, not force them to understand, but help them to understand that they have a stake in effective maintenance and strengthening of the global economic system, not for some broad reason of ideology or because we're telling them to do it, but because it is in their very practical interest. They have an interest in sustaining and continuing the openness of the global trading system. They have an interest in the proper functioning of the global financial system. They increasingly have an interest in a smoothly functioning global investment environment. They have an interest in working together for the freedom of the seas so that all the raw materials they're getting will be able to move freely from the source to China. They have an interest in working with the United States and other countries to make sure the global system works effectively. So increasingly, the nature of the dialogue between the United States and China must be to work with them to explain to them and help them understand that what many Chinese already do, that they have an interest in strengthening and the effective functioning of the global system, not because we tell them to do it, but because increasingly, as a country that depends on that system, they have an interest in exercising this responsible role in making sure the system works. And they need partners to do it just as we do. And that really is, I think, one of the challenges of the dialogue over the course of the next several years, to ensure that we can work with them on that, and that over a period of time, they develop this sense of responsibility for trade, for investment, for protection of intellectual property, for avoiding discriminatory policies like indigenous innovation, because their companies will benefit when they adhere to these norms, because their companies have an interest in other countries doing the same. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Bob. Let me just say that we need to thank a few people who helped sponsor this meeting. Certainly the Wilson Center and Lee Hamilton, State Roy have been enormously helpful in putting this all together. David Richards, who is intellectually collaborating with us on this, has made a very important contribution to the success of these labors. And Lu Mai from the Chinese Development Research Foundation, sitting down on my right, is a very important Chinese counterpart. He is going to not only contribute to our discussions, but hopefully bring some of the insights back to his own country, as we'll try to do ourselves in the Washington context. But next I'd like to introduce Graham Allison, who formerly was Dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard University and now is the director of the Belfer Center. Graham.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Bob for being here and giving us a little bit of what we were discussing at lunch. Dick asked me to try to be provocative since we're here after lunch, and so it's easy to nod a little bit, so I will try to do so in my 10 minutes. As I already said to the smaller group at lunch, I think the starting point for thinking about the topic is Thucydides, and so I'm going to repeat that point briefly. Now, if you remember, Thucydides, the greatest historian, explained the Peloponnesian War, which was a catastrophic war for both Athens and Sparta, as follows. He said it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this inspired in Sparta that was the fundamental cause of the Peloponnesian War. So here you had two great city-states, one of the probably the pinnacle of civilization, maybe ever, but in any case in the ancient world, in 5th century BC Greece. Athens rose, so that's half of the story, and Sparta, which was the hegemon of the region at the time, feared the consequences of this, and that combination of objective circumstances as well as a lot of details, which historians dealt with, led to a catastrophic war. As Dick has said, a starting point for this project that we've had as a collaboration with Chinese colleagues has been to understand that actually Thucydides' insight works pretty well for a lot of history. Not all. It's not an inevitable set of iron laws of history, but if you were betting it, and if you looked at the last 12 or 14 cases, most of the cases turn out catastrophically. Most of the cases are more like Germany rising, challenging Britain, becoming the cause of 2 world wars in the 20th century, than they are like the U.S. rise, which turned out to be peaceful. If you want a brilliant chapter on that topic in the book that Dick and his Chinese colleague edited from the first set of exercises, there's a chapter by Ernest May and a Chinese colleague on this topic. That is why this is not inevitable, it's just likely. Okay? So that's point one. Point two, outside they'll have given to you, or there'll be copies of a case I give students in a class that I now have to teach all by myself because Joe Nye has escaped. And so in any case, in this course, which I taught this past spring, I tried to be as provocative as possible to get students to think about the rise of China and the consequences for the U.S. So the case starts with a provocative hypothesis, extreme hypothesis, not one that I subscribe to. Okay. The thesis being that China Inc. has a serious strategy for achieving hegemony in the Asian Pacific in the near term and for becoming the world's leading power by the middle of the century. Now, the way the case works in this course, students are working for somebody in the U.S. government. In this case, I gave Bob Hormetz a copy of this at lunch today. It says, quote, "You're a senior policy advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton." Okay? The secretary has just returned from one of these brainstormings with her husband, where they're big thinkers doing provocations. Okay? And the provocateur, for the purposes at hand, makes this argument. this thesis, let me say it again, that China Inc., what he calls China Inc., invoking the old Japan Inc., is a coherent management that has a serious strategy for achieving hegemony in the region, in the near term, and in the world by mid-century. Okay? So this provocateur cites, among others, Neil Ferguson, our colleague at Harvard, and Martin Jacques, who's When China Rules the World, and produces evidence and analysis to support this provocative proposition. So as Jacques says, well, as Ferguson says, we're living through the end of 500 years of Western ascendancy. The past 10 years were the decade in which the world tilted east. This is Neil now. And Jacques, as you've seen that book, or if you've looked at it, argues, quote, China's rise signals the end of the global dominance of the West and the emergence of a world that will come to shape, that it will come to shape in a host of ways that will become increasingly disconcerting and unfamiliar to those who live in the West. Close quote. Now, what evidence does this provocateur cite for this argument? In three dimensions: economic, military, and political. You can look at the case to see, but in the first instance, in economic terms, the provocateur cites Goldman Sachs, Hormetz's previous employer, who says that by 2027, China will become the world's #1 economy. Actually, just in the recent few months, the deputy head of the Chinese Central Bank celebrated China's overtaking Japan as the #2 economy, though that's still a debated proposition. And those who debate that it hasn't happened yet do not debate that it's not going to happen this year or next year or the year after. So how does China go about doing this in terms of China's Inc. strategy? First, it's got a multi-pronged strategy economically to dominate the means of production by employing an essentially mercantilist growth model, an undervalued currency, protectionism at home, driving export-led growth. So as Paul Krugman has argued, I think persuasively, but we'll have a chance when Fred and others talk about the economy tomorrow, that China has a, quote, unambiguously predatory monetary and trade policy. He cites the late Paul Samuelson in an authoritative conclusion, at least for my money, that, quote, persistently misaligned exchange rates create genuine problems for any free trade apologetics, close quote. So the mercantilist trade policy is complemented by an active program to steal intellectual property, so this provocateur argues, that combines cyber penetration, requirement that companies bring their IP to open factories in China, and gives as evidence for this Google's response to China of late, but also the very public comments made by the head of GE, and also at a meeting with Wen Jiabao, which was the most shocking of all, in public, arguing. These were the heads of Siemens and BASF, that the, quote, indigenous innovation program, well, it is now these are the words of a Chamber of Commerce, a U.S. Chamber of Commerce study that's just coming out now is, quote, the indigenous innovation is a massive and complicated plan to turn the Chinese economy into a technological powerhouse by 2020 and a global leader by 2050. So the case goes through more economic data. I'll, for purposes of brevity, refer you to the case. Militarily, there's one other one. As Larry Summers, our old colleague, likes to be quoted over and over, and he likes this quote, isn't there something odd about the world's greatest power being the world's greatest debtor? I would say, yes, there's something extremely odd about that. Militarily, The case is harder to make for the provocateur, but he points to the fact that Chinese military spending has grown fourfold since 2000, that China is focused on developing asymmetric disruptive capabilities, including anti-satellite weapons and techniques for cyber war, about which my colleague Joe Nye will say more. Politically, according to the provocateur, China's internal objective remains stability. Stability first, stability second, stability third. The leaders are fearful of the instability they experienced in the Cultural Revolution and their narrative about the collapse of the dynasty at the beginning of the 20th century, which opened the door for foreign intervention and disintegration. The chosen strategy for political stability is high, sustained economic growth. In effect, the deal is as long as they can deliver to citizens 8% growth or greater, the Communist Party's monopoly of political power can be sustained. To the extent that China has a foreign policy, Taiwan being regarded by China as not foreign policy but a renegade province and therefore an internal issue, it's to support this economic imperative, that is, for high rates of economic growth. And the notion of having a coherent foreign policy or an influential foreign policy is postponed until after the economic objectives are achieved. The recent examples of China's, for example, failing to join the international consensus in blaming North Korea for sinking the South Korean ship, or China's expansion of investment and trade with Iran, just as the U.S. and others are sanctioning Iran, or, you can see there's plenty of other such examples. Okay? So, and then the provocateur has one last line with respect to the politics, and I'll stop. Okay? He says, the provocateur concludes that given China Inc.'s objectives and strategy, it hopes that the U.S. remains preoccupied with foreign adventures, like Iraq and Afghanistan, and paralyzed over internal political divisions, and thus distracted from what's actually going on. So China welcomed the U.S. investment of $2 trillion to topple Saddam and build a new Iraq, and it regards as even more promising America's ongoing efforts to build a stable, modern Afghanistan. So the assignment to the students in this case was Secretary Clinton has asked you to pause, stop back from current events, and conduct a strategic reassessment of the U.S.-Chinese relationship. For the purposes of the exercise, she asks you to assume that the provocateur's extreme China Inc. thesis is valid, something that she doesn't accept, but this is for the purposes of the exercise. In response to the challenge, she asks you to develop 3 strategic options for U.S. policy. The first, characterizing America's current strategy towards China and presenting your best estimate of where that will leave each country in 2025. The second and third, offering significantly different U.S. strategies and identifying the pros and cons of each from the perspective of U.S. vital interests. So I hope that's enough to provoke you after lunch.
You're not going to tell us what the answer is.
Oh, not yet.
Not yet. Okay. All right. Well, that's very, very provocative. Charlie Mayer, who is a professor of history at Harvard, has been mainly a European specialist. He's worked deftly on the interrelationship of economics and politics, and he's raised the question of to what degree does the integration of a region in economic and political terms eventually constitute an empire. He wrote a book. The answer to the question that he posed, I think, wasn't in the book, as to whether or not the United States is an empire. According to certain definitions, it obviously is, and according to others, it is not. But one of the most interesting questions is, are we confronting in the future perhaps the interplay between two imperial-like colossi, the Chinese on the one hand and the American on the other? And since he knows how to handle all these questions, I turn it over to him.
Graham has certainly provoked me. I don't know about the others, and I'll postpone the empire issue.
postpone the empire,
Well,
okay.
you've given it to me for tomorrow,
right.
so give people a reason to come back. Look, I think we had at lunch, in fact, three. We've had three differing points of view, and I want to speak briefly on the analogies with whether it's Sparta and Athens or Germany and Britain in the run-up to World War I. My thinking is, though, if hegemony, that is, a sort of predominant leadership, is seen as a goal, then it's inevitable conflict must exist, because hegemony is a zero-sum concept. It implies that the non-hegemon accepts a position of inferiority, and the hegemon will always think the non-hegemon is rather churlish if that country will not accept it, a spoiler, and the non-hegemon thinks it's being put in a position of systemic inferiority, which, in the terms of this contest, has to resolve in some sort of conflictuality, not necessarily war, but certainly not easy relations. So I think we have to get out of the hegemonic framework. It's Procrustean. The case study is, in a sense, Procrustean, and that may be a good way of teaching policy responses, but I don't think it's good for understanding history. Now, we also had at lunch another view by Jia Jingguo, which I found much more attractive, and that is that we, especially I feel it as a historian, we are privileged to be living in an age when, after 3 centuries, a huge region of the world, the most populous, is recovering. One, its economic welfare, the glory it formerly had, and I'm thinking of South Asia as well as East Asia, different parts of it, and a claim to sharing and inspiring our own civilization. Now, that may be too utopian for you. Richard Hormats presented, I think, the third view, which is that there are common interests that we can all share. So I think the hegemonic framework or non-hegemonic framework is really only one that we have to adopt, and in fact, when you read Thucydides closely, he's a brilliant historian, perhaps the most brilliant analytically. He says that, in fact, as Graham rightly said, that Sparta's concern about Athens encroaching power was the deepest cause of the war, but that concern was manifested. Athens took the opportunity halfway between the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian Wars to impose a much stricter form of domination. It collected tribute. It said it was going from hegemon to arche, which was a different sort of quality of leadership. So I think we have to look at decisive actions. And also, what I'll bring up very briefly at the end, this conflict was mediated by problems and conflicts over allies. And this is crucial. There are never just 2 players in a game. There are always multiple players, and 2 players don't control a game. Now, we do think an analogy, history, and after all, history offers us the only storehouse of previous examples. We can't use the future for that. And the analogies are never perfect, and they're always going to be debated. Must there be a Chinese-American strategic rivalry? Must it lead to conflict? That's the question. I don't think so. Let's use the other analogy. Look at which came up in an earlier meeting, and some of you may be familiar with, and that is the run-up to World War I, the British-German rivalry in particular. This fits in, of course, into the pattern of wars of hegemonic transition. I think Robert Gilpin coined that phrase. Woody Allen, one of the best summaries of the causes of World War I, in Woody Allen's Zelig, wonderful movie, Zelig at one point says, oh, yes, World War I. World War I happened because Germany owned the world, and Britain owned the world, and Germany wanted it. And that's not a bad summary, but again, it forgets a lot of people. Why did Germany seek naval power for a decade? It finally conceded it was not going to overtake Britain in this regard. The British wouldn't let it. There were bad reasons, vainglory, the Kaiser, the notion that it had to have this, and there were some better founded reasons, widespread commercial interests and the like. Why did Britain resist this? Well, Britain essentially thought Germany dominated, had the decisive land-based military power. It certainly didn't need sea power, which Britain was used. So you had a problem of asymmetric forces that were involved. Well, this complicated it, and it was a very complicated run-up, and it's, as opinion goes back and forth to what degree Germany is really the crucial actor. But let me give you 3 levels of lessons, very briefly, that I think. One, which concerns the topic of this conference. Economic interaction, no matter how intense, is probably not sufficient to retard hostilities if you really get a strategic and geopolitical crisis. This was the premise of Norman Angel's famous book around 1910, The Great Illusion. He thought, the countries are so intertwined in trade, Britain and Germany were, in fact, that there could be no way they could go to war. And in fact, in 1914, within a few weeks, this illusion broke down. Second, so I don't think we can ensure ourselves by economic intercourse. It will lead to certain interests being for peace, but they can get overwhelmed. And one of the reasons the pro-peace parties become overwhelmed, so to speak, why the hawks can prevail in a crisis, and the doves, or the owls, to use Joe's term, are relegated to the rear, is that international rivalries become fault lines in domestic politics. They're seized on. In America, they've been seized on ever since the 1790s, with the great choice we had to make between France and Britain. People look for reasons to profile themselves politically, and international politics is always there. But all countries reveal this, that international rivalries are not antiseptic, and they take place within the framework of domestic politics. The history of Greece and Rome demonstrates this to a very sad degree. And it's true in democratic societies, and it's true in non-democratic societies. Within a given party state, they will become the fault lines. So therefore, it's likely that rivalries can get out of control. The escalation is not only international, it's domestic between hawks and doves. And fourth, so that's the second, international rivalries become third line. The third thing is that powerful nations are constrained by commitments to allies, weak allies and strong allies. Britain decided it lived in splendid isolation until 1898 or so, and then it felt vulnerable at the Boer War, and it was worried about what was happening in East Asia, and it tied itself into a system of alliances. It never really wanted to recognize or concede they were alliances, but in fact they constrained its behavior. Germany was constrained by Austria. France and Russia were locked into mutual issues. Britain and France were locked into issues. To me, this is the source, really, of potential escalation in any given strategic interest. And it's what Woody Allen forgot. He forgot Austria-Hungary, and it was falling apart. He forgot the Balkans. He forgot Russia, which was really the big 500-pound gorilla on the European continent at this point. Not necessarily an aggressive one, but clearly it was huge, and it dominated German strategic thinking. Athens and Sparta go to the war through Corinth and other states that keep on tit for tat all the way up the ladder, and it becomes much harder at any given crisis to fold, to use the poker term. So this means that issues that are seen as peripheral, whether the Balkans or the decline of the Ottoman Empire or colonial disputes, are linked to the center by allies. And that is really, Henry Kissinger loves to talk about the tragedy of international relations, but this is, in a sense, I think the real quasi-tragedy of international relations. We need allies, and they give us problems. I mean, look, we're discussing, the Middle East is not an easy arena for us for many reasons. So we don't control, no matter how hegemonic or contending powerful, we don't control the momentum of events. And if we look at the South China Sea or wherever, we don't control Taiwan. We don't control South Korea. And most important, and what is still a sleeper in this thing, but I think will be very important, is we don't control Japan. They have legitimate, and we can't define, we can't envisage how they will define their own security cases. So in a certain sense, this seems to me crucial. China certainly has strategic interests in East Asia, and we have allies. And as a result, and we have defined it, we went to World War II in Asia, or we helped to, push the Japanese I'm not shifting responsibility for it, but, we told the Japanese in 1940, 41, we will not let you exercise hegemony over China. And the Japanese chose the most irrational of responses, but they faced a real dilemma as they saw it, and for their political system as well. So I would close with two issues. Three conclusions. One, the process of international politics is very difficult, and we make it more difficult for ourselves if we see zero-sum hegemonic games. Secondly, it's not inevitable. The leaders of 1914 behaved, many of them badly. The head of Austria-Hungary behaved badly. The head of the secret services in Serbia behaved despicably. The French made some miscalculations. The Russians couldn't figure it out, in a sense, just behaved, I think, rather dumbly. And the Germans chose the worst outcome, too. So it's not inevitable, but bad things can happen to semi-bright people. And in a sense, this is what happened. So crisis, we have to walk on eggs throughout this. And thirdly, the lesson I drew when I wrote a book on 1989, it was the last time it was the Wilson Center, is that surprise is crucial. 1914 was a surprise. 1989 is a surprise. We're always being surprised by history. So hang on to your seats. Thank you.
Terrific. Okay, next is Joe Nye, who's written on a whole series of ways in which the international system can be stabilized through soft power, hard power, smart power, leadership. But now he's going to tell us really what we should do. Joe.
Well, the title of our session is Historical Challenges. And I'm going to argue this afternoon that the greatest historical challenge we have in U.S.-Chinese relations is the misuse of history. If we look at Neustadt and May, Graham mentioned Ernie May earlier, they warn against misleading historical metaphors that have disastrous policy consequences. And to pick up Graham's point about fear in the second half of Thucydides' famous proposition, exaggerated fears lead to disastrous policies. And that, I think, would be the moral of the story that I'm going to tell. But let me give you two examples. To pick up where Charlie left off on World War I, there's a lot of talk about the 1914 example. China will be to the 21st century what the Kaiser's Germany was to the 20th century. The destabilizing, rising power leads to a major war. Robert Kagan has written this. Arthur Waldron has written this. I mean, this is not you can find this in the literature. The trouble with it is it's lousy history. I mean, it's a great metaphor and it catches attention. It's good for a case like Graham has here to stimulate students. But a smart student resists it. Let me tell you why it's lousy history. First of all, Germany had passed Britain in industrial production by 1900. Whatever else you say about Goldman Sachs and their projections about China, and there's a lot wrong with the Goldman Sachs projections, but just assume they're right. That means we have another 20 years before you have the U.S.-China relationship where the German-Britain relationship was 14 years before World War I. What's more, even if the Chinese economy in aggregate size is equal to the American economy, which we should expect to happen someday given the size of China, it doesn't mean it's equal in composition. You look at per capita GDP as a way to measure the composition of an economy. And in that sense, there are various estimates, but probably China won't equal the U.S. until somewhere near the middle of the century, if then. The second thing that's bad about the history of the 1914 metaphor is German objectives were very uncertain. They were thrashing about. Nobody knew quite what they intended. There's the famous Eyre-Crowe memorandum in which the head of the British Foreign Service says, I can't make out what Germany is doing, so we have to assume the worst. Chinese objectives are not like that. When the Chinese say that they're focusing on stability so that they can have economic growth and development, I think they're right, because without that economic growth and development, they lose legitimacy and they lose the control by the Communist Party. So it's very, very different from the Kaiser's Germany. And third is, if you look at the geopolitical situation of Britain in 1914, it was caught up in a triangle. Britain's closest neighbors, Germany and Russia, were both larger than it was and were rising in power. Indeed, the triangle of fear that was relevant, Germany was afraid of Russia, which made Germany act in certain ways, as just as Britain was afraid of Germany. And that essentially is very different from the situation of the United States, which today has two oceans and two weak neighbors. So these historical analogies to 1914 are just bad history. But they certainly get a lot of credence when people want to write an op-ed and reduce history to one or two catchy lines, or a case for a course. Now, in terms of Graham and I developed a lot of these cases. Graham and I developed a lot of these cases together, and the point is to provoke students. I'm telling you what a good student answer should be like.
Nothing like colleagues.
Equal time.
There's also the misleading metaphor of decline. I mean, people talk about the Americans are on the end. The problem is that we don't know what decline means when we talk about countries. People often think of it as an organic metaphor, but in fact, there's no reason a country can't go on for several centuries. It's worth noticing that Horace Walpole, the British statesman, said after Britain lost its colonies in the 18th century, "Woe is Britain, we're now reduced to a miserable island like Sardinia or Denmark." But of course, he missed Britain's second century, which was created by the Industrial Revolution. Nobody knows, or take Rome. I mean, Rome went on for 300 years from the apogee of its power to its final decline in the West. Nobody knows how long countries will last. If you were to ask about the decline of the U.S., which is now the new conventional wisdom, I think you can make a number of scenarios, some of which the U.S. declines and some of which it doesn't. In fact, I've just finished writing a book that's about this called The Future of Power in the 21st Century. But I think you can make as good a case for the non-decline scenarios as for the decline scenarios, maybe even better. So the future is open, nobody knows, but the argument that this is an inevitable process based on organic decline, or the example of Rome or whatever, is just doesn't, it's bad history. It's also very popular now to say that the U.S. is in the same situation that Britain is. As Charlie said, people have this hegemonic theory. Hegemonic theories are nonsense. Nobody can tell you how much power a country needs to be a hegemon. If you don't believe that, ask what was the United States in 1945. It had sole possession of nuclear weapons, and it had about half of the world's product. And yet for the next 5 years, it was unable to prevent the loss of China, to stop the Korean War, to stop the Russians from developing a nuclear weapon, and so forth. So what's hegemony? What's it mean? Nobody can specify the resources that lead to the behavioral outcomes you want. So all these theories of hegemonic stability and hegemonic transition that people like to throw around are usually bad history. I mean, they don't look carefully at the history. But nonetheless, if you look at this question of whether the U.S. is in Britain's place, which some of our Harvard colleagues have cited, and some at Yale as well, it's worth noticing that in 1914, on the eve of World War I, Britain was the third largest country in military power and was the fourth largest in GDP. That's not like the United States today, folks. Not at all like it. And what's more, Americans go through cycles of believing in decline. It's fashionable. After Sputnik in 58, we thought we were in decline. After Nixon closed the gold window and the oil crisis, there was a belief that we were in decline. After the Rust Belt closures and the deficits of the 80s, we were in decline. We grossly exaggerated the strength of Japan and the Soviet Union and so forth. Ironically, by 2001, we made the opposite error, thinking by 2001 we were the world's only power, can do as we wanted. Of course, that led to disaster too in Iraq. And now in 2010, we're back to decline. The polls show the majority of Americans think we're in decline again. What this should alert you to, this little bit of history of declinism, of cycles of declinism, is it's much more about psychology than about reality. So look much more carefully at reality and don't accept conventional wisdom. Now, what's this mean for U.S. and China relations? What it means is that if China believes the U.S. is in decline, and if you read what's written in China now, you'll find an increasing number of Chinese saying the U.S. is in decline. And they judge this on the success of China in coming out of this recent crisis, financial crisis, compared to the U.S. And if the U.S. thinks it's in decline, the U.S. is going to react with too much fear, and China is going to react with too much confidence, which makes it very difficult to manage a relationship which is going to have many points of friction in it, many points of positive sum, many points of zero-sum relationships. What it means is, in the words of a top U.S. official who's involved in the U.S.-China relationship, said, we try to accommodate China, but every time we try to do something that accommodates their interests, they read it as a sign of weakness, and so we have to get tough. That's an interesting cycle. That means that the belief in decline in China leading to overconfidence, in U.S. to too much fear, can itself become the cause of policy. So even if I'm right about the long-run trends, in the meantime, things can go badly wrong because of a set of mistaken historical beliefs. And that's, I think, where we are now. So I was going to say something about cyber, but I've run out of time. But I would summarize this by paraphrasing Franklin Roosevelt from another context. When it comes to U.S.-China relations, we have nothing to fear but fear itself.
Good. Graham, do you want 1 minute?
I may have provoked Joe into joining the course again this year. Maybe in the discussion we'll come back.
You want to come back to it? Okay.
I'd say give Ezra his say. Yeah.
All right, Ezra. Ezra is, everyone knows Ezra. I mean, he's an expert on Japan who's also an expert on China. He wrote a best-selling book, I think 1981, perfect timing, on Japan as #1. He has, however, declined to write China as #1 because he thinks it wouldn't sell. Is that, not that it's not true. But in any event, he's now working on a biography of Deng Xiaoping and has spent a lot of recent time in China, dealing with China, and he has some very interesting thoughts about China-U.S.
Thank you, Dick. Just to make sure we got the history right, it came out in 1979.
Oh, yes, even better. That's right. Okay.
I'm trying to think what a good student would write in answer to the provocative case that Graham has presented. I think a good student would also try to understand China and would try to look at the particulars and the complexities of their history. And some of that history, as Charlie Mayer says, continues. You got to keep at the history, but the way you look at history also changes as you get more powerful. I'm going to try to present 3 or 4 big problems in the last 50, 60 years that I think affect Chinese thinking and that will require a response and require us to understand those. And I think that the way the Chinese look at those issues now is already very different than it did at those times. The first one, of course, is the Civil War in China, which ended up in the nationalists escaping to Taiwan. And then the Korean War intervened. And as a result of that, the Chinese communists never got to finish the Civil War. And from their point of view, that's been an enormous thorn on their side and has become the symbol for all that's wrong. And anybody stopping them from intervening and taking over that island is causing a horrible thing. Now, when they were not very powerful, they could not do very much about that. And they had to more or less let America set the pattern of strategy. And what our strategy was when we normalized relations, began to develop relations and normalize relations with China, was to say that the people on both sides of the straits think that they're part of China, and we don't have any quarrel with that, but we want it to be resolved peacefully. Later on, of course, the problem was not that the two sides both wanted to unify China, but one side began to think they would go independent. So we have quite a different situation where one part of that, Taiwan, now wants independence and mainland doesn't. And where the United States felt that in order to give Taiwan the security that it would not be forced to agree to something it wasn't after they'd been our ally for so many years, that we would be willing to sell them weapons and ensure that they were not attacked and invaded. Now, of course, as China gets stronger, they say, first of all, they say our relations with Taiwan are much more peaceful. Why should the United States feel forced to sell weapons to China? And also, selling weapons to China interferes with our resolution of the problem. I think underneath what mainland wants to do basically is to have a kind of an intimidation situation where Taiwan feels they have no choice, and that they would then work out some kind of agreement in that kind of situation where China would be reunified. So that's one change in the historical issue. A second one, I mentioned that we Americans feel, I think, very strongly about it, and that is 1989 when Tiananmen occurred and the Chinese clamped down on their own people. We felt we had to impose certain kind of sanctions. And some of those sanctions were not selling military weapons and not even supplying parts for weapons and systems that we had sold them during the 1980s. In the 1980s, as we were working with China in dealing with the Cold War, we developed quite good relationships with them, and our Pentagon also had really quite good relations with them. But after 1989, when we would not sell them parts for the helicopters that we had already sold them, that was extremely upsetting to China, and I think we haven't thought enough about what that implication of our doing what we thought was perfectly understandable and correct from a human rights point of view. It had an enormous impact on how China feels about having relations with the United States military, how much they can trust the United States to develop relationships. And then there are certain American leaders like Rumsfeld who are not very forthright in promoting exchange programs, and some of the Chinese felt terribly humiliated when they wanted to have exchange programs and we didn't allow those. Now China is in a much stronger position, and those things come back to them, and I think there are certain instincts that some of the Chinese have. They didn't want to have military relationship. They humiliated us. Now why should we rush into military relationship? And especially we can't really rely on the United States about equipment and cooperation, because in a crunch they will say, well, American politics changed or American attitudes changed, and therefore they're not really a reliable supplier. So I think that has really had a deep impact on those. Then there's another relationship, I think, that began to develop around 1995 when Lee Teng-hui came to the United States. And from that point of view, from that point on, China was very concerned about the danger of Taiwan going independent. And so they realized that they could attack Taiwan if we were just attacking Taiwan, but if the United States came to the defense of Taiwan, they couldn't defend against that. So they had to think of what they could do to try to deny American access or assistance to Taiwan, all the things they could do that would interfere, discourage America from coming to the aid, or if there were some kind of engagement, prevent the United States from having a big effect on the outcome. Then, once they began to develop military weapons after that, then they expanded their mission to a global mission as they become a greater power. So they're no longer concerned about just the Taiwan issue itself. They're concerned about protecting energy around the world. And for the Americans who have been accustomed to think of America as the dominant military power that's able to make decisions about those, if people in the United States feel that that is what we're at and we're trying to defend that situation, then what the Chinese are trying to do becomes a very concrete threat. And they're now seeing themselves, they're developing a naval capacity, and therefore if the Americans believe that we really want to dominate and have a stable situation that we control, then what the Chinese are doing can be very disturbing. I have a certain amount of optimism about the capacity of the Chinese to come to some kind of agreement on all these issues from the person that I'm studying, Deng Xiaoping, because I think he really set the pattern for Chinese development, and he realized that for Chinese development they need a peaceful world, and that they have so many internal domestic problems that if they didn't have a certain amount of stability, they would overspend on the military, and they wouldn't be able to resolve all the things they need. They wouldn't have all the technology, the assistance to develop the China internally. And I think that the Chinese have also made a real effort to have a broader public understanding of this. It's not as well known in the United States as I think maybe it should be, but there were a series of 10 Zhongguo Jueqi of China, the rise of China, that were played in China, where they studied the rise of various different countries that were really well known by the Chinese public. They were extremely well done, carefully presented, and they showed what happened in Japan and Germany in the early part of the 20th century and the horrible impact of that. So I think that they have done and made an effort to educate their public to learn the bad lessons of history, to learn what Joe and I would call the right lessons of history and not the wrong lessons of history. So I think that while there are plenty of problems we have to look at as we understand the particulars of the Chinese-American relationship, that there are real grounds of hope that we can manage this much better. Thank you.
All right. Now, let me just indicate the next moves that we're all going to make. First of all, wouldn't everyone like to stand up and have a breather? It's been very long. And then we're going to have a discussion among the panel and with people from the audience participating. So let's take just 2 or 3 minutes to stand up, relax, and then we'll continue the discussion.
And arguments presented by the advocates were less than half of the case. Okay? So that's perfectly sound and appropriate. But I think even in crafting it, which I had fun doing, and which I plan to use it in a version again this year, the notion of invoking China Inc. Was not accidental, okay? Because, again, many students may not remember, but this audience, or most of us, are old enough to remember, as I think Joe already suggested. We heard this analogy before, okay? There was Japan Inc., and it was a very plausible hypothesis, plausible enough to persuade some of us that Japan is number one, okay? Just about hitting the peak for the point of terminal decline, perhaps, or maybe not terminal, but in any case, dramatic decline. And I think, therefore, Joe is absolutely right to remind us that especially in the press, but also in the academy, fashions change faster than facts. So that's certainly right. The third point, because Joe recalled the Neustadt May book, Thinking in Time. So if this inspires any students, I would say go back and read that book. You'll learn more than you will have learned in this discussion. It's a terrific book. But one of the things that Ernie enjoyed quoting was the Mark Twain line that history never repeats itself, but it does sometimes rhyme. So I think that's exactly right.
Yeah.
So in the case of hegemons, yes, they're not exactly hegemons, and it's a little bit of a complicated category, and you can't quite tell. But I think actually from Thucydides' proposition, there's a reason why that's famous, and it deserves to be famous. And it points to both sides of the problem, which is so important, I think, in trying to think about U.S.-China currently. So it was not simply the rise of Athens, and certainly anybody who would like to try to argue that China has not risen dramatically in the last 30 years is, I'd say, forget about it, okay? And it's not simply the fear that inspired in Sparta, but if you pan on television to any American audience anywhere, what is the most likely symbolic representation that you'll see from people when the television comes to focus on them? They hold up their hand, one finger. We're number one. So that's a baseball team, a football team, a television show, every dumb opportunity, I would say. Okay? But deeply, deeply ingrained. So as was suggested, the opportunity for this to play back into politics, into domestic politics, is large. And if I'm betting about the U.S. for the next decade, again, crystal balls are always hazy, but I think there's going to be high unemployment, and I don't think Americans are going to mainly blame themselves. Okay? And I think there's going to be huge deficits, and they're not going to mainly blame themselves. And there's going to be go on and on and on. So in those circumstances, I think this is another reason why the analogy is powerful for our thinking about avoiding not the inevitable, but the possible, maybe even the likely. So I like the case as a provocation for, I think, forcing people to think through a question that they probably wouldn't think about otherwise.
Very good.
Just say I agree with Grant.
Okay, you just said it. I think, yeah, I'd like to make one. Yeah, okay. Just to make one quick point. Oh, I'm sorry about that. I think one of the things to take seriously is this whole question of trajectory. Are trajectories only the normal curve, up and down, or do you find cases where you go up and down and then there's another blip, and you can come back from what seems to be an inexorably, downside movement? I mean, the Brits obviously did that along lines that Joe was sketching. Many people thought Britain was finished in 1800. And yet it was really just moving into the throes of the Industrial Revolution, which was so significant. There were many people who thought the French were completely finished as a great power at the time that the French Revolution occurred. And yet when they gathered themselves together through new social and democratic processes and liberal processes and so on, they became infinitely stronger than they'd ever been in the 18th century, when they were regarded as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, powers. Or look at Japan and Germany. Many people said Japan and Germany were finished by 1939, and their industrial curve had gone up and it peaked and it sort of stopped and tailed off, and that was that. But in an entirely new kind of international system and new economic system, they had this great rebirth that took place in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and so on. So it's very hard to say, just because you go up and go down, that therefore you're finished. In many cases, there is this extra little surge forward that is not, I think, fully taken into account. Go ahead.
I didn't mean to
No.
interrupt you. I mean, I guess out of this discussion, I'd say one thing is, first of all, every power, rising or falling, sees itself as particularly vulnerable in a crucial way. And every power, in a sense, will debate these issues in terms of we've got to act now because we're going to just become more vulnerable. So there's this sense in any international system almost that you're locked, everyone is in decline, which of course is a very dangerous set of perceptions. Secondly, we do think in time often. It's a good thing, but we often don't think elsewhere. And that is, we really have to think about how other people see us. Look, why is a fall a bad thing? Powers decline. Why is the fall of Rome something bad? We don't really need, people running around with looking like gladiators. The fall of Rome was a fantastic setback to the European economy in many, many ways. Long-distance trade, urbanization. Let's keep an eye on what's important about losing relative power and what is not so important. If the United States will not maintain its relative power, it cannot maintain the position of 45. The debate won't be over whether we lose it in 10 years or 100 years. The question is, can we accept a world in which we don't have to think in these terms this way, and in which we can sustain the level of trade and welfare and the improvement, as was said again at lunch, in people's incomes? Can we redeem a continent which has had a miserable time in the last 50 years, and that is Africa? These are issues that transcend, I think, this, but we really have to keep that in mind. Otherwise, we'll get hypnotized by this up and down, what you said, this movement.
Okay, we're open to the audience for questions. Alan.
Let me just raise this question of timeline, which Charlie was just talking about. We seem to have this fascination with the rise of China, particularly in the context of aggregate GDP. And in various debates, Goldman Sachs saying, well, now it's not even 2027, it could be 2017. But, and here Joe raised a very important point, we're talking really on composition with respect to per capita GDP. Per capita GDP, by anybody's estimate, is decades and decades out. We're not talking about the next 20 years with respect to China. It is a large emerging market country with a lot of poor people. And that is the character of China at this point. My point is but that's not the way we see it when we discuss the politics of it. If you listen to the press in the United States and elsewhere, it's all about the rise of this new power. But it does seem to me it is a much longer time frame, both in military terms and in economic terms, than most commentators are prepared to address.
Okay, I think that's a good point. I don't think we have to have every member of the panel address this. Why don't we take a few more questions?
Can I just make one point, because I think what Alex reminds us, and go back to Ezra's point. So how natural is it that we decide that Taiwan should be independent and protected from China? For Americans, this is completely natural. It seems only reasonable. It seems fair. Actually, we won the war, blah, 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 whatever. If it was Hawaii, we would say, boy, that seems strange. Or I remember Rumsfeld gave a stunning press conference in which he said, how in the world can China need to expand its defense budget by 17% last year to $57 billion? Who are they threatened by? And we're sitting with $570 billion of defense, which is, of course, natural. Okay? Theirs is threatening and ours is peaceful, okay, or whatever. So I would say that to explain to Americans why that's not natural is probably harder than to explain to Chinese, why they shouldn't have more. So I'd say that's just baked into the process.
All right, in the back.
Hi, I'm a reporter with Phoenix TV. I have a question about current event on South China Sea and Yellow Sea. And actually, in recent this issue, I think Chinese media think some people called it as containment, to try to contain China. And also on last Friday, Washington Post, the headline news is about Obama administration is taking tougher stance against China. So I just want to know about this current issue, like what happened? Is this kind of turning point or something like that? Thank you.
Joe, would you like to address that?
If you look at the last 6 months to a year of U.S.-China relations, I think what you see is the Obama administration comes in, they want to do Fred Bergson's G2 without calling it that. They want to cooperate in all sorts of areas. If anything, Hillary Clinton goes to Beijing, doesn't mention human rights. They defer the Dalai Lama's visit to the White House. They think they're accommodating the Chinese a lot. The Chinese, in the meantime, think, oh, Americans are accommodating us because they've gone really badly in this economic crisis, and they see how strong we are and how well we're doing. So the Chinese say we should increase or include more things in our core national interests. We push a little harder on no Taiwan arms sales, no Dalai Lama visit. You go to Copenhagen and you have this very strange mixed-up behavior. But in one of the things that it looked like from the Americans' point of view was that Wen Jiabao was sitting in his room refusing to meet with the American president and sending a lower-level official to meet with the American president, and then allowing a lower-level official to shout at the American president and point a finger at him. And so the Americans eventually got the feeling that we've done these things for the Chinese, and the Chinese, thinking that's a sign of our decline, are just saying, well, let's push a little harder. And it really isn't until the Americans actually reply by the Taiwan arms sales, by accepting the Dalai Lama visit, that you begin to see that there is a second thinking about this. Steinberg and Bader go to Beijing and talk about this quietly. Hu Jintao comes to the summit, the nuclear summit in April, and things begin to get a little bit back on track. But it does illustrate how easy it is to make mistakes in managing a difficult relationship when you have these underlying misperceptions of what the overall situation is. And something like the Chenan incident and the Americans in the Yellow Sea is, to my mind, or East China Sea is, to my mind, has to do with North Korea, not with China. But China reads it as deterring or containing China. And so I think it's extraordinarily important to go away from these myths and to have actually practical conversations to avoid the misinterpretation of what of events leading to these cyclical responses.
Yes, over here in the back. With the hat.
Hi, my question is about a point that Mr. Vogel and Mr. Meyer both talked about. Well, I want to bring these 2 points together. So, Mr. Vogel, you brought up China's perspective of foreigners interfering in their what they see as internal affairs, and then Mr. Meyer was talking about the sort of having all these allies together. And so China has a value of non-interference in their foreign policy, and they're kind of creating allies based on this idea of we'll have economic relations with you, but we won't interfere in your domestic affairs. So I wanted to know if you see this as a potential point of conflict as well, or is this something that we'll work through in the future?
Let me start.
Yeah, go ahead.
When China was an extremely weak power, they were very worried about foreign powers, then non-interference became an extremely important position. But the world gets more complicated, and as China goes abroad, it's now moving into Africa, it's moving into Central Asia, it's moving into Latin America, and a lot of things it does has a big impact on domestic developments, and it does work with certain officials and not others. And so I think that China, in the long run, is going to have to adapt on this principle that started out as a pure principle when they were a weak defensive power. And I think that in a few years, they won't put that quite the same way they do now. But I think that they still, of course, cite the earlier principles in dealing with issues like Taiwan, where it's to their advantage. They will naturally use those arguments, which have been very central to their perspective when they were a weak power.
Yes, right here.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the panel to build on...
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, I'm Michael Yehuda, currently with George Washington University.
Yes.
I'd like the panel to address one of the major points, it seems to me, that Professor Meyer made, saying that at issue is not just the direct US-China relationships, but it involves issues of allies, and this creates enormous complications. And it seems to me we're just going through that right now, in the sense that the United States has what it calls allies and friends in East Asia. Chinese claims in the South China Sea, and to a certain extent in the Yellow Sea, directly affect that. Furthermore, it has brought the United States, through the Secretary of State, for the first time to declare the South China Sea, or what's going on in the South China Sea, as American national interest. I don't think there's an example beforehand of saying that, other than saying that they want the sea lanes of communication to be open. Now, aren't we seeing already, therefore, a situation in which the relationships with allies and friends are becoming the key point of friction between the United States and China? Obviously, there's the larger, if you like, issue of interpretation of international law as to what is the open sea and not the open sea and so on. But over and beyond that, I think what Professor Meyer has said as one of the big issues is happening already in front of us. And I think we need to think through more carefully how this is going to be handled. After all, it's in a context in which China's trade relations with these allies, with these friends, is now much greater than America's trade relations with these countries. So we're in a situation in which their economic and trade relations are becoming, if you like, more centered on China, where the security relationship is still very much related to the United States. So I think there is a danger all the time thinking purely in terms of China-US and who is the hegemon or not the hegemon, or decline or not decline. But meanwhile, we are seeing, I think, what Professor Meyer pointed out, drawing on the European experience, to a certain extent being played out right now.
You want to comment on that?
Well, I mean, you in a sense amplified my point, and when I look closely as a historian of international relations at relations with allies, they seem to me always very fraught. If you define a strategic partner, friendly state, ally, you take a pledge to it, and if this is, I think, response to the question there too. You take a pledge to it. You say, if you get in trouble, I mean, we are here to help you. That part of the pledge is often forgotten. You often seek an ally because you think the ally will help you, but you end up having to help the ally. And if you look at so many conflicts, they are strong powers dragged into conflicts because of commitments they feel they must honor with powers that are not as strong. The risk of not taking those steps is that the power you would like, the middle power, will seek its accommodation with the power you feel is your adversary. So making an alliance is always between a rock and a hard place. It's not quite as hard a place as the small power, which is sometimes squeezed on. But I agree, and it's got to be thought through. And at each point, I think, ultimately you have to be able. This is going to sound. Ultimately, you have to say to an ally, we're not going with you down to the end of the road on this issue, on another issue. Had Germany said that to Austria in 1914, it would have been catastrophic for the dual alliance, but it would have saved the world from World War I. So I see no easy resolution, and I just share with you your sense that this is a very difficult situation, and I think really the most difficult in a world with many different powers, some strong, some less strong.
Could I just make one small addition to this? This is not new. In 1995, when I was in the Pentagon, we had the same issue. China is declaring that it had a territorial claim on areas within 1,000 miles from its coast. And at that time, we issued a statement that, and this doesn't have to do with allies. This wasn't Japan or anything. This was a question of freedom of the seas and openness. We said, this is not a territorial sea, even though Chinese military gave us a map, which with a deep pocket that showed this is territorial. And we said we regard this as subject to the law of the sea, and we take no stand on the territorial claims. And then China altered its policy, became much more conciliatory on this with the Southeast Asian countries because they were interested in a better relations in ASEAN. More recently, the Chinese have been building structures on some of these some of these are little sand spits or rocks. But once you build a structure on it, then you can claim it as territory. Then you can claim a territorial sea and an economic zone 200 miles from it. And part of what we just said in Hanoi was to say, no, we don't accept that encroachment. And when China declared this to be now one of their core interests, whatever that means, that was a step where I think we felt we had to say no. And it didn't have anything to do with allies. It had to do with this view that China was taking this deep pocket that they drew and was trying to fill in the dots.
Joe, can I ask you a question? I mean, I agree with this. And, the United States went to war once over rights of freedom of the seas and defined it many other times. At what we can say no, but how far would you advise us to back up such a statement of no with successive actions? At what point does this just become a conflict we would have all wanted to walk away from?
Avoid, yes.
I think this is a conflict which can be easily managed as we handled it in '95 after we made a clear principle. If you look at the naval balance in the area, there's no question about if you allowed this to become a conflict, that the Americans would prevail. But it's not something we want. It's something which we ought to be discussing quietly and not letting it get into a nationalistic thing. I think Secretary Clinton's statement in Hanoi was not an excessive statement.
I don't know.
Let me make a footnote on this, please, because I think it's an extremely important question. And I would just make 2 points. First, as Joe will remember as well, the Taiwan episode in the late 90s, where ultimately the U.S., as China was practicing missile launches over Taiwan, moved 2 carriers into the Straits. And that was a high-risk venture because if a missile had hit one of the carriers, it's highly likely that the U.S. would have responded to that by taking out the relevant missile base. So then you'd be having an attack on Chinese mainland. That's not the only possible response, but it was a quite plausible response. And then ultimately that quieted down. So that's to remind us that the U.S. was prepared, at least to Charlie's question in that instance, to raise the risk level. Okay. Secondly, Joe underlined the most important point here, which is the current balance of power in naval terms is like 100 to 1. Okay? Now, operating just close to Chinese coastal zone, not quite so because you can shell things from land. But when this becomes to be a closer balance, even in a regional setting, then what we regard as natural may be regarded as a unnatural imposition by somebody else, quite plausibly. So I think Joe's right that the management of this will require a lot of very subtle conversation, not just some general principles.
Yes, right here.
My name is Rebecca Huan. I come from Canada. I came from China as well, and a lawyer in Toronto. The question I have is, other than the historical nature of the Taiwan issue, I'm wondering whether this issue should have a diminished role in the relationship between China and Canada, or whether, China and America, or whether America should play a different role now going forward. And I say that because at the grassroots level, I understand that there's a lot more integration between mainland China and Taiwan, commercially, economically, and then because I also live in Canada for many years, and you probably are aware that in Canada we have the issue of Quebec, the independent issue of Quebec, and the province of Quebec held referendums twice for the Quebec people to decide whether they want to be independent from Canada, and twice they said no, although the second time was a close vote. And so then my question to you is that if Taiwan people or the mainland people try to decide themselves in a peaceful way whether Taiwan should be independent or not, why America will be, what is the reason for the United States to be continually, to be militarily interested in insisting that Taiwan should be independent? Or whether the American government should really consider playing a different role instead of being military defensive for Taiwan, but rather playing a more facilitated role to make sure that the issue between mainland China and Taiwan will be resolved in a peaceful manner according to the agreements or the mindset or the viewpoints at the grassroots level.
Yes, sir.
Well,
sorry.
Why don't you give me the difficult questions? I think that the United States does not want to interfere and does not insist on Taiwan being independent. And if the two sides could agree peacefully, I think the United States government position is that they would be happy to accept that. And the United States has played a role when there was a real danger of Taiwan pushing independence too fast and provoking the mainland, of trying to quiet Taiwan down to avoid the conflict. And I think that now, while we have made real progress on Taiwan and mainland working together and decreasing hostility, that we have a real opportunity of moving forward, and I don't think the United States government would block that. I think we do have certain historical relationships where we sold military weapons to Taiwan, and I think it's an interesting question as to what our policy should be on that, whether we should begin to change that policy or begin to work with Taiwan and mainland in changing that policy to try to reduce it. But I think the overall context is that the United States does not take sides on whether Taiwan should be independent. We don't support independence.
Let's see. All right, right here.
Thank you. Undersecretary Hormats said that we should focus, or we should take into consideration U.S. domestic conditions and how that will affect our position in U.S.-China relations. And Professor Allison, your rosy prognosis was unemployment and deficits, but I want to hear your view or the view of anybody on the panel on China's domestic conditions. It was just today in the New York Times that they talked about the increasing proportion of properties that are being bought by state-owned enterprises and how these companies are in some ways fueling the land boom that the central government is saying that's focused on controlling. And land prices in Beijing have gone up 750%, they say, since 2005. And the urban-rural inequality is increasing too. So I wonder what you think the prospects for stability, economic stability in China are in the short and medium term, and how these conditions might affect the Chinese role in or the Chinese foreign policy positions.
I'll give just a brief comment, but then I turn to Ezra, who I think might have a better estimate. Estimating China's ability to sustain this level of growth, I mentioned, I think, at lunchtime that I've listened at least on 7 occasions. People say this can't last for another 5 years, or this can't last for another decade. And I've watched this marvel, over 30 years. I mean, Larry likes to note that they're at a 10% growth rate, you double every 7 years. So there are individuals living in China who will see 100-fold increase over the course of their life in the national income and even in their own incomes. So this is like a marvel that, history doesn't include any of these. So this is already a unique case. And so how long can they continue doing it? Having thought that they wouldn't keep it up for another 5 years more than once, I'm now sort of saying, well, as a pragmatist, I don't see why they're not able to sustain a very high level of growth. And I think whereas one would normally say that a government that monopolizes political power in the way that the current government does inherently becomes incompetent. If one watches its performance over the last 20 years, and in particular its response to the economic crisis, which will be the next panel, one has to say, well, this group seems to be able to manage quite well. So I wouldn't, bet against it. But Ezra, I'll turn to.
I'm sure there are economists, maybe in the next session they can get into their views. But as I see it, that the growth has been possible because of the huge population. In the case of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, once the labor, the small labor supply, wages rose, they could no longer compete for labor-intensive industry, and they had to only move up scale. China, by being so huge and having such a backward area, they still have a huge population in the West where they can still go at fairly low wages, and also where infrastructure really has an impact on the economy. If Japan builds yet another bridge to Shikoku, where they already have 3 bridges, the increase in GNP is probably not going to be very great. But in China, where you build some new highways out in the West where there have never been highways before, and industry begins to grow up around it, that will have a big impact. What China now has to do is to move from just having basic investment as a source of growth into getting more efficiencies and better use of capital and making that transition. And that's the new challenge for China in order to continue the growth rate. And I hope the economists like Lu Mai will talk about that more next time.
We have one question from the overflow room. We have neglected what they had to say, but I think it's a good question. Is part of the U.S.'s concern with China's rise simply a vertical desire to burn the bridge after the U.S. has already crossed it, so that no one else can do so? In other words, are we really just trying to keep ourselves still singular, unique, and so on, and prevent anyone else from inheriting the role that we previously have had for the past 50 or so years? I'm open to anyone on the panel. Yes?
In 1992, there was a famous defense policy guidance written by Paul Wolfowitz and others, but which was when Cheney was Secretary of Defense, which said that indeed the objective of American policy should be to prevent the rise of a peer competitor, and that was a major objective, which might be characterized in these terms. I think that that's for reasons that Charlie Mayer gave more eloquently than I, that's a foolish objective. Power is not good or bad per se. It's a lot like calories in a diet. Too much of it can get you into a lot of trouble. Quite literally. I mean, the belief, I referred to earlier the mistakes that have come from people misreading power as decline. Misreading power the other direction can be equally disastrous, and if you read Charles Krauthammer, June 10th, 2001, the virtues of the new unilateralism, in which he says the Americans are so powerful we can do what we want and others have no choice but to follow, that was extraordinarily expensive. So the idea that sort of being number one and asserting that power and preventing others coming along is the right answer as a policy guidance, no, I think that's a mistake. I think what you have to do is take what Charlie said, is that you're going to need enough power, just like you need enough calories to be able to get what you want. But in the kinds of challenges that we're facing in the future, we're going to have to work with others to get the outcomes American people want. And one of the major others is going to be China. It's also going to be Europe. We forget that Europe is still an economy the size of the U.S. and sometimes acts as one in economic matters. We also forget that Japan is still, maybe just virtually by a hair's breadth, the second economy in the world. But even if China passes it, it's still a major player. We're going to have to work not just with China. We're going to have to work with a lot of other countries to deal with some of the things we have to deal with. And the whole attitude we have toward power is one in which we have got to get away from this idea that we're on top and hold others back, but figure out how can you create the networks in which we can leverage the fact that we'll be better positioned in networks to organize the kind of cooperation we need. We have to think of a new narrative of power, and that question from the other room is right. That's the kind of narrative we need to get away from.
I know Fred wants to raise a question on that, but I'd just like to make one comment. There is a game theoretic argument that in any game, sometimes the number 2 player is better off than the number 1. Because the number 1 player undertakes all the obligations, spends all the resources, and so on, initially engages in all the wars. And the number 2 that stays back and isn't necessarily as frontally engaged in all of those things sometimes does magnify its GDP as a result of that and make some very substantial gains. So even if it were true that it was the United States was certainly going to move to the number 2 position, the number 2 position may have certain advantages that we haven't fully thought about before. Fred.
Incidentally, there's an economic version of that which says that the small power can get away with a lot of stuff the big power can't.
That's right, exactly.
Competitive undervaluation,
Right.
trade control,
Exactly.
the kind of things the Chinese are now being hammered for.
Yes.
If they were still a tiny country, nobody would much care. You could get away with it. You could export unemployment. But when you're big, you can't.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to Joe on his fascinating and I think critical issue of conflicting perceptions. You characterize the Obama administration, I think quite rightly, as having held out a very open hand to China's first year and then being disappointed it didn't get reciprocity. Were they wrong to do it? Were they wrong not to anticipate that China would read them the way you say they did? I mean, you all are the experts, but I remember in my political science courses, Lenin said, if you hit mush, push on. Now, this was not quite mush, but by permitting themselves to be characterized as, quote, weak, was that a mistake? And does that have to be an important guideline for future policy?
My answer to that would be yes, that I think their general attitude toward China was correct, that we are going to have to develop a deep cooperation with China to deal with a lot of the issues that affect us, China, and the rest of the world. But not mentioning human rights on the trip to Beijing, or postponing the Dalai Lama's trip, I think were misread. And those were small things. I mean, those were little signals that you could have. There's a proposition. If I talked about cyber, which I've been spending a lot of time thinking about for this new book, We and the Chinese have a major problem on cyber. We think the Chinese are stealing us blind on intellectual property, including defense industrial base. The question is, now we do a lot of things the Chinese too, but it's not stealing, it's spying, to put it simply. No, the Chinese intrude on our systems to steal, we intrude to spy. But they're both intrusions. Question is, could you imagine an arrangement where you say, you knock it off, we'll knock it off? Very hard. And one of the questions it brings you to is, how do you start a bargaining in an area like this or in general? One of the insights of Robert Axelrod's evolution of cooperation is that the best strategy for cooperation in the long run is tit for tat. In other words, if you simply always cooperate, you're going to be played for a sucker. If you always defect, you're going to essentially wind up with zero-sum outcomes. And both those strategies are suboptimal compared for tit for tat, in which you can develop structures in which cooperation is seen by both sides to be the most beneficial. One of the dangers, if you don't have common perceptions, a tit-for-tat strategy, instead of leading to cooperation, can lead to what's called defection lock-in. In other words, if I don't understand why you're doing tat, and I do tat back, and you do tat back, and I do tat back, we can get into a negative sum outcome of defection lock-in. And that's why communication is so important, so you understand what you're doing. So if you're going to do something, let's say in U.S.-China relations, as the Obama administration did coming in, you have to explain pretty much what you're doing. And if you want to do something in cyber, for example, if you want to say, if you go on the way you are, we're going to do a few things to hurt you, but we'll also help you if you do certain other things. Unless you communicate that, there's a great danger of defection lock-in. So I think if you don't think of the strategy of tit for tat and evolution of cooperation and how perceptions affects it, you're probably going to get into trouble.
Can I just comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
And I think carrying
Wait.
carrying your communication point forward, I would have thought the optimal conclusion of that would have been agreed rules under which you did your tit-for-tatting. And I think of the global trading system,
Right.
which is explicitly based on tit-for-tatting
Yeah.
under agreed rules. You have reciprocal liberalization, and if you violate your commitment, the other guy is authorized to retaliate against you under agreed rules and procedures.
Yeah.
So
But look how long it took to work out those rules. And we're in cyber, just to give that example, we're in a cyber about where we were on nuclear in 1945 or 50. I mean, we just haven't thought this through. And the question is, how do you communicate to begin to develop those rules? With the development of the Cold War, I wrote an article about this in the late 80s, nuclear learning and U.S.-Soviet arms control cooperation. It took a long time to learn enough to be able to cooperate. And we and the Chinese have to realize that we've got to get on with that business of communicating about what's the larger game, and then we can get to the rules.
Charlie.
Well, I was going to mention the Axelrod book too. I'm all in favor of peaceful initiatives, but they can be read as hitting mush. And a lot of the debates over the origins of the Cold War, which I followed very closely, were about people, critics of policies, American policies, saying we didn't show enough openness, and others saying we showed too much to Stalin in Eastern Europe. I do think, and this is a question I'd have for others who know China, whether our China policy in some way must also be predicated, or is also predicated, on the notion that ultimately this regime will evolve into a less repressive type of situation, more open, more competition, if not under forms of Western elections somehow, because it does seem to me that we can bracket an American political contention and discourse will allow us to bracket something like Tiananmen or the Dalai Lama or even Taiwan if the election doesn't go for reunification, only so far. We are a country that responds to human rights decisions. And so I do think that underneath this managed world, there must be some vision that we have implicitly that China will become change politically in some way as well as economically? And if so, this is what's the well-foundedness of this? I mean, we applaud these strikes, I think, that have taken up the headlines in the last week as evidence of some of this motion. And I think ultimately my view of the world is that as you move toward a type of multipolar regionalism, that in fact each of these regions, the Chinese one in particular, will become less, one more open. Just as if I looked at the African future, I would hope for political stabilization and stuff. And that maybe it's pie in the sky.
Dick, could I say a word about that? How I think the
You
Chinese-
really can't, actually, unless it's awfully quick.
You let him
I'll
say
try,
yes
to,
or no.
I'll try to be quick.
Yeah, all right, go on, go on.
I think the Chinese do not believe that they have to move to our system right away. And I think a lot of the assumption that China will become more like us may not be.
Right.
They are trying a different experiment where it's something like the way our businesses run. They try to get people they think are the most competent, have a very careful in-house selection, have them become the leaders, and then try to, it's based on history, where you had a meritocratic bureaucracy for a couple thousand years, and hope that those people can provide the leadership, and that by being sensitive to people's demands, they can make decisions that are basically good for the collective as a whole without granting the rights of suffrage. I think that's a dominant view, and I think personally it's unrealistic to expect that that's going to change right away.
All right, I wanted to say one thing on the question of being trapped into defect in peace in game theoretic terms. The one way out of tit for tat is, of course, Pavlov. Pavlov is win, stay, lose, shift. So you don't get stuck playing defect, 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 time after time after time. But we are now all going to defect and immediately go to coffee outside. And thank you so much.